Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy is predicting that 2023 will usher in victory for his troops in the war with Russia. That optimism, though, comes as Russia's military bombarded Ukrainian cities on New Year's Eve. Russian President Vladimir Putin lashed out against the West and Ukraine in his New Year's address. Both leaders' comments comes as the prospect for highly anticipated peace talks appear to be falling through. Joining me now is former Special Assistant for National Security to President Bush, Michael Allen. Michael, welcome to Fox News Sunday. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So in Ukraine, this missile bombardment ushered in the new year. At the same time this week, Putin flat out rejected President Zelensky's appeals for some kind of a peace summit. What do you make of where we are?
Well, the Russians, of course, are still trying to wear down the morale of the Ukrainian people and, of course, say to the Europeans that we're in this for the longer fight. But I think what the Ukrainians want more of is more assistance from the United States that they can grow their leverage to enable a future peace negotiation. I don't think it's ripe right now. I think Russia still feels like it has cards to play. They're buying new weapons from the Iranians. They're putting more troops on the field. And the Ukrainians certainly feel like they have a long way to go. After all, they're winning and they're making progress, especially in the south. So while Zelenskyy can put out a peace plan and say, here's where I want to get to eventually, no one's in the mood to really compromise yet.
So to that point, Zelenskyy is pursuing and asking for a peace summit with the Russians. At the same time, when he was here in Washington a few weeks ago, he asked Congress for this whole new slate of offensive weapons. What does that tell you about where he sees the end game for this war?
I think Zelenskyy knows that he has to keep his foot on the gas in order to go ahead and get Russia out of his territory before the West gets tired of funding his campaign. I think that's the big rub here. He wants to signal, especially to the Europeans, that he's willing to do peace talks eventually. But Zelenskyy came here to the United States, and I was glad he did, to thank the American people for their generosity for funding and transferring weapons to the Ukrainian people. I think Ukraine's defense and their war with Russia is actually in the national security interest of the United States. After all, they're a bulwark. Ukraine, are a bulwark against a Russia that's moving westward and might have threatened NATO. And they're also able to degrade the materiel and manpower of the Russian army so that we might be able to eventually pivot to Asia and not worry so much about Russia if they're degraded. So these are reasons why we should support Ukraine.
To that point, take a listen to President Zelenskyy. This is what he said to the U.S. Congress.
Your money is not charity. It's an investment in the global security and democracy that we handle in the most responsible way.
What would you say to those Republicans who have criticized U.S. support of the Ukrainians as a blank check?
Well, I think there's a lot of oversight that the Republicans in the House of Representatives can do. The Republicans, of course, will be in the majority here this week, and they ought to launch a very aggressive oversight campaign. They ought to insist of the administration that the Secretaries of Defense and State come to the Hill, testify what is the administration's plan, what is our end game, and just how is all the money being funded. I think at the same time we can support Ukraine, but also be very tough with the administration on what their strategy is and how the money's being spent.
Putin's relationship with another U.S. adversary, Iran, seems to be growing stronger by the week. Iran is shipping kamikaze drones, short-range ballistic missiles to the Russians right now. Also, interestingly, this week, the Biden administration said there are Iranian personnel on the ground in Crimea right now,
right,
working with the Russians. It sounds alarming.
It is alarming. I think the short-range ballistic missiles is what we're going to see increasingly more of. It's important for Russia to try and maintain a strike capability into Ukraine. So I think we're going to be able to see more evidence of that going soon, just as we've been able to see the kamikaze drones so far. But, Iran is a state sponsor of terrorism, and for them to be on the ground in Crimea assisting the Russians with their weaponry is certainly, a sight to behold.
Americans have all been watching for weeks now as these protests erupt across Iran. They have been characterized as a battle between a young, modern population and an aging ruling class. Do you think, as some analysts have said, these protests could be a real tipping point? Do they threaten the regime?
So not yet. On the one hand, I think it's promising that these protests are ongoing. Second, I think there have been more broad-based than just the students, but I think you need it to be more broad-based in order to have some success. On the one hand, it would be great if the parents of the students were out there protesting as well. Recently, you had some oil workers who went on strike in solidarity with the students. I think you need to see more of that to get the regime really, really worried. After all, they have secret police, they have security services, and they're brutal and fierce. They've already killed hundreds of Iranian students, and many more they'll put to death by execution. So I think they're firmly in control right now, but eventually, they're sowing the seeds of their own eventual destruction.
What about the nuclear deal? Do you think that these protests and the fact that public opinion there in Iran is now so firmly against the deal could mean that it is dead once and for all, really?
Well, I know Biden keeps saying that it's dead. His administration, however, says something like it's not on the agenda right now. I think they want to revive it as soon as it would be decent in their mind to do so. I don't think they can do it right now when there are protesters on the streets and getting killed and the rest by the regime. But I think they want to keep it warm and return to it one day, because I think they just have this sort of religious zeal that they believe this is the best way for them to tackle the Iran program, the Iran issue, even if the deal that we struck with them isn't that great on non-proliferation issues.
Maybe like a cat that's lived 7 of its 9 lives, something like that. Michael,
Exactly.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Happy
Great
New Year to
talking.
you. Appreciate it.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.